and sexy models. Now it's men with earrings in converted warehouse studios in the East End. This one's doing photorealism, a style that was invented 35 years ago in New York and died out soon after. What's he doing it again for? Let's go on prowling moodily through this modern art studio of nowadays, interpreting the signs. The big no, the first two letters of nowadays. No to genius, no to beauty, no to art where you can tell what's happening. Here's a modern artist who's made some paintings of words to go with her sculpture of a full stop. She's going to be showing both at the Tate Gallery. Modern art today is full of words and full of sounds. This slightly menacing horror music sound, like the soundtrack for a modern art programme, is actually some modern art, being made by this artist who's also just had a show at the Tate. Hey look, it's a painting by me. I painted it at art school. It's cosmic op art. And now it's going to be me talking. I wonder what I'm going to say. Why is it when we think of modern art, the art of today, that we don't think of this anymore? A genius artist in his studio drawing a nude woman with charcoal. What happened to make that idea of art an old hat idea? This is my studio in Derbyshire Street in Bethnal Green. I share it with a load of other artists who also never draw the model and who mostly have never seen a nude woman in an artist's studio outside of Hollywood films about Van Gogh or Michelangelo. At this moment, they're upstairs or along the corridor, testing out every activity under the sun except life drawing to see if it could be art. At another moment, behind a cloud of sexy Gauloise smoke in a studio along the great dark corridor of time, is a real genius with a big pen, the biggest pen of all, the pen of Pablo, drawing a face. War bad, Picasso said, peace good. That was the 1950s, the time when I was born, when Picasso was a communist. Because it was a time when modern art really stood for something, and a scribble and a line and a few dots by Picasso could seem to sum up everything, nobody laughed at his solution to world conflict. But they did sometimes cry about his drawing. Why, a child of 6 could do it, Royal Academicians cried. They hated Picasso and everything new. They wanted everything to be old again. But now it's the 90s, and I'm in my 40s, and it's a whole different world. Today, modern art is a real pig, a pig sawn in half with a chainsaw and suspended in a vitrine of formaldehyde. Or it's a photo of a blankly staring, post-feminist woman of the 90s. Or a tent by another woman artist, embroidered with the names of everyone she's ever slept with. Or the London tube map, but with all the names of the stations changed to nonsense. Footballers instead of Jubilee line stops, philosophers instead of the Circle line. So that's modern art now, and what I'm going to be doing over the next 6 weeks in this modern art series called This Is Modern Art, in a kind of ironic, doubtful way, because no one knows what modern art really is travelling through time. Looking at the modern art of the past and back again to the modern art of today, to see what the past has to say about the present, and what the present has to say about the past. This is what the inside of my head looks like. It's like a museum of modern art of the mind. There's some abstract expressionism. Later I'm going to be looking at 3 giant turning points in the history of modern art, all coming out of this place, the real Museum of Modern Art in New York. Huge, white, magnificent. Anyone who's ever been there will know the sheer confidence of the display, the scale of it, the feeling of authority and credibility that it has. New Yorkers go around with that model of modern art in their heads. More or less, not the ones on crack, of course, because Americans want this kind of art. It answers a need. What is this need, exactly? Modern art is a mixture of snob culture and amazing open-mindedness, like Andy Warhol. Modern art is a system, but one that's always changing. Warhol stands for one of its big changes. Later on, we're going to be meeting him, plus two more geniuses who moved the parameters of modern art. This is the first one, the big cigar of modernity, Picasso. This is Picasso's Les Demoiselles d'Avignon. Les Demoiselles d'Avignon is the picture at the beginning of all modern art books. It's the picture that started Cubism. It's hardly a picture at all. It's a monster picture, a parody of a picture, painted in one way and then half painted over in a different way, without caring if the seams show. 5 ugly, angry, glaring prostitutes in a brothel with their armpits showing, and their blank, indifferent, dead faces staring out, or their primitive, dog-like African mask faces. From the eyebrows out to the folds of the curtains, everything irritates everything else. Everything is spiky and jostling, as if it's the painting, not the women, glaring out like an ugly, angry, shocking, exciting art joke. When I first saw this picture in a book at about age 17, I didn't think this is Cubism. I thought this is modern art, the hard stuff. Sarah Lucas, defiant woman of the 90s, icon of young British art, up against the wall, defiantly redefining what it means to be modern. This abject, wretched, stocking monster called Bunny, which Lucas made in 1997, is the sister of Les Demoiselles d'Avignon, only 70 years younger than them.
Picasso is somebody I identify with. I mean, just in terms of the amount of sex in his work, I suppose. The amount that's the subject, or the way they would transform, say, fruit, or even just lines that aren't break up a face in a certain way so that you can see a penis in it or something like that. And like where he turns a pair of handlebars into a pair of horns. I'd say you come very close to the kind of transformation that I'm using with ordinary objects to stand for something else.
Dumb things transforming in the mind. This sculpture has a 1990s tone of jokey contempt. Nevertheless, it's a work that comes at the end of an art timeline that begins with Les Demoiselles d'Avignon. It's art that would be impossible without Picasso. It laughs at the cult of the macho, but it respects the thing that the sex myth of Picasso really stands for, Picasso's cult of change, of perpetual renewal.
In my mind, he kind of stands for one of the artists who managed to carry on changing and rather than just kind of reiterating their old work and their freshest work being when they were younger. So that's one of the things I probably admire about him.
I find Picasso very moving, not disconnected from my world, but part of it. What does he stand for? He stands for ceaseless creativity, not caring, not being snobbish, having his own system, never being polite. On the other hand, he also stands for a kind of atrophying of the restless modern art mind, where, whenever his name is mentioned, tasteful music starts up, and we stop thinking. The Picasso Museum in Paris is not an unfamiliar sight on television, and a presenter waddling about it, waving his arms around, is not unknown either. So how do you make this old art subject new? Well, for one thing, you can acknowledge that we live in a world where artists like Tracey Emin and Sarah Lucas are art stars, and where Cubism is no more important than any other ism, and no ism is all that important. And consequently, for different people with different interests, there are a lot of different Picassos. There's the genius, and he is that. No one could be here with the energy of this art and not feel he was a genius of some kind. But there's also the absurd, decadent, rich person who could buy a chateau for the price of a drawing, and the old, macho, outdated sex monster, obsessively fixated on the image of the artist alone in the studio with a naked female model. The woman rendered again and again as a kind of hilarious, exploded, uglified, beautifully painted male sex fantasy. Sex and death, Picasso's great themes. This is a picture of his friend who committed suicide from unrequited love, Casagemas, done when young Picasso hadn't become a genius yet, but was just pastiching already existing styles, from Van Gogh to Toulouse-Lautrec. Everyone knows Picasso's blue period. Informed art world people think it's a bit sentimental. Everyone else loves it because it's sentimental. It's the stuff after they're not sure about, the genius stuff. When Picasso first painted La Demoiselle d'Avignon in 1906, when he was only 27, he rolled it up in a corner of the studio because he didn't know what it was. Even his friends didn't like it. Georges Braque said looking at it was like being made to drink petrol. But then gradually Picasso and Braque came to acknowledge it as the prototype for Cubism. It isn't interesting to think about Cubism as an ism anymore, but it is interesting to think about what it actually did. It made the painting more important than the picture. It made inventing more important than copying. It meant reality could be gutted and boned and put back together again as something else, as art. Picasso never made art from nature, he just made it out of his head. He made it up. He held on to reality only to have something to push around. Picasso was the first to think Cubism was a boring idea. Almost as soon as he invented it, a whole school of academic cubists started up. So he stopped putting the eyes on the side of the head and started putting them in the right place for a while. That was his neoclassical period of the 1920s. But then he put them in the wrong place again. And after that, just switched back and forth stylistically all the time. From smoothed out to jagged, from wildly distorted to calm, from angry to funny, from ugly to beautiful. Picasso the genius, lover of many women, destroyer of them, stepper-over of their distorted and cubified bodies. I don't despise the corny myths of Picasso the ego monster, Mr. Lovepants, but I know they're not the art. They're just the Hello magazine version, and I'm only faux Hello. I think there's a real Picasso, and it's in these real shapes and bodies, the bits and pieces that make up this art. This is the Picasso system in operation. It's here in this museum, but it's in our heads too. Art's new systems of now are mutations of his old system of then. Here we are on the lovely Riviera, looking for the essential Picasso. Picasso was always changing. When he was in his 60s, the new model was Mediterranean Picasso. The Mediterranean is timeless, classical, ancient, all about sensuous, timeless pleasure. Only Picasso could mix all this up with aggressive modernity. After the war, he was given this museum of local culture in Antibes to use as a studio. Modern art was hated by fascists, so it must be good for peace, it was thought. Picasso became France's official expresser of the new post-war happiness. He roamed the building, taking down the old official art and replacing it with smiling triangles. His paintings here aren't particularly well known, but they're the sublime, playful side of Picasso. These are modest masterpieces of ordinary life, the pleasures of the domestic and the everyday. To me, they're the awesome achievements of modern art, full of details of real things changed into painted things. Modernity with Picasso is Picasso's joie de vivre let loose, frolicky and funny, and feeling good without caring what others think. But of course, he didn't have to care, because a big support system of mythology and market was doing all that for him. This was another modern art system that Picasso invented, the system of the modern artist as entrepreneur and showman. Mediterranean Picasso is Picasso number 2 in the various mythologies of Picasso, Picasso rich guy. In his old age, he lived a magnificent, rich, bohemian life in the south of France, moving from villa to villa, filling them up with new creations, watching wrestling on the TV, and having Gary Cooper round to visit, his favourite film star. He was thought to be the highest paid man alive. He called himself a communist, but Moscow called him a decadent. He didn't care, though. When he wasn't painting, he was out making sculptures that changed the language of sculpture forever. And ceramics that made him laugh. He was full of beans. He thought if he never stood still, he could live forever. That was what drove him. But that's one thing modern art can't do. This is almost the last picture he ever painted, a self-portrait from the year he died. It was 1973, Picasso was 92. Modern art wasn't just Picasso anymore, it had been taken over by New York. What a picture. Picasso is always dead for us, it's part of his myth. He died, he stared death in the face before he went. He was trepidatious, guilty about all the lives he'd stepped on and destroyed on his path to genius. New York started taking over modern art in the Second World War. By the 1950s, the job was complete. Picasso was still producing, but not progressing, it was thought in New York. Progress was the big thing now. But who could be the sign of progress? Who could be as big as Picasso, but have the necessary newness? Jackson Pollock, artist of the abstract drip, doomed forever to be a cliché.
What do we see when we see a Jackson Pollock? We see what Pollock stands for. Jackson Pollock stands for freedom, self-expression, and being American, and for a particular American financial success story. We see money building up. This painting, Autumn Rhythm, failed to sell at all when it was first shown in 1950, even though the asking price was only $1,200. After Pollock died, it was offered by a dealer to the Museum of Modern Art for $8,000, and they were appalled at the price. Then it was offered again for $30,000, and they didn't even reply to the letter. Eventually, the Metropolitan Museum bought it for $20,000. A trustee said, a painting this big must be worth something. 20 years later, in the mid-70s, the combined value of all Pollock's works in public and private collections was estimated to be $50 million, because he was a giant of American art. What else do we see? We see the whole tragedy of Pollock's life. Towards the end of it, he couldn't paint at all. He was a depressed alcoholic. He was violent. He used to punch people. And if they punched him back, which they often did, he used to cry. He had terrible insecurity. He thought he was a phony and a sellout. But the papers saw him as a macho, primitive, hard man, the tough guy who said, I don't paint nature, I am nature. But what do we see in just the look of it? The sheer feminine beauty of whatever it is, the image or the rhythm, its containment across all those yards, the energy and facility and delicacy of the paint, the way it sits on the surface of the canvas but sinks in at the same time, the way it's flat and spatial at the same time. All that ease and grace, the illusion of something that's been made on instinct alone. What a weird mix of elements makes up our idea of what Jackson Pollock is.
The romantic myth of the tortured artist. I like it, because I'm a bit romantic myself. I started coming to New York a lot in the early 80s, drawn by the allure of the hip, up-to-date, cutting-edge art that was being churned out here all the time then. But I often found myself secretly yearning for the old stuff, the abstract expressionist stuff. The abstract expressionist moment was the 1950s. It was an existential moment. It was all deep, anguished, pained, late-night soul-searching. It was a life of woozy, boozy, semi-intellectual or intermittently intellectual, existential loneliness.
This is the Cedar Tavern, New York's famous bar, where Jackson Pollock and the abstract expressionists used to come and drink in the 1950s. Actually, it's not the Cedar, but a remake, put up after the original tavern burnt down in 1963. But to this day, people still come here in search of the abstract expressionist myth, expecting to find it steaming off the tables, perhaps. "Come out and fight," the abstract expressionists used to growl at each other when they met here. They'd rip the doors off the hinges. Jackson Pollock actually did that one night, and they'd punch each other and insult each other and say, "I'm more sincere than you," or "I'm more authentic than you," or "I'm more existentially tortured than you," or "I've had all your women," which was one famous insult that the art critic Clement Greenberg was supposed to have hurled at the painter Willem de Kooning in a drunken brawl. Like many of these myths, it turned out to be only partly true, as Greenberg later revealed. There was only one of de Kooning's women he liked, and that was de Kooning's wife, Elaine de Kooning. But in all this macho comedy, there was tragedy and there was pathos, and that was what was going on in Jackson Pollock's head.
He was a very angry person and a very unhappy person. He'd be very subdued when he was sober, but when he got drunk, then the aggression would come out, and he would be very, very difficult, very aggressive. When he'd go into the Cedar Bar, he'd say, "You fucking whores, you think you're painters? You don't know anything." It's just, self-destructiveness was overwhelming.
Pollock's art was a mystery art of pure abstraction. There was nothing in it except art. It made sense to him as a natural development from the Picasso system. But he found the process of getting it over to the public by playing up to the media literally mad-making. It resulted in a Pollock who was alienated from himself. Nowadays, we find it normal for modern art to be in the papers a lot and for the stories about it to be all exaggeration and rubbish, from outright jeering to accolade overdrive. But that was all new in Pollock's time. His escape from art world hysteria was his home here in East Hampton, 3 hours' drive from Manhattan. He lived here with his wife, the artist Lee Krasner. Every week he went into New York to see his analyst and to hang around with artists and critics. And then he came back here to paint and to worry about who he was and what his status was. Why was he so popular, anyway? He was thought to be a wild painter. He painted on the floor because he was wild. He used cheap household paints because he was rough and tough. In fact, he used quite expensive household paints because they got the effect he wanted. He got the paint out of the tins onto the canvas in big sweeping loops using sticks or old dried up hardened brushes. But he didn't just get it all on there at once. He worked in stages, building up an image. It isn't wild art. It's deliberate, sophisticated art. It's good art. But there is wildness in it, and that's why it's great art. Spontaneity, chance, ugliness are all definitely in there, making something new, something graceful and delicate and odd, which even today we can't quite pin down, however blasé we think we are about the myth of Jackson Pollock. This is the real Pollock, really painting. But it's also the mythic Pollock, painting for the camera, like Picasso playing to the camera. Picasso was at ease with being a showman, but Pollock wasn't. Perhaps because it was the wrong show for him. I always think it's odd how delicate everything looks here, how untough it all is. By the time this film was made, Pollock's dream of art had started to turn into a nightmare. Nothing was real, everything was constructed around him.
I don't think that he had a terribly large ego, but he performed a lot in order to get attention. He wasn't an intellectual. He was charming and attractive, but very shy, actually, not a big ladies' man. And Lee really dominated him, you know. He was submissive and she was aggressive. She was aggressive in all her relationships.
Yes, but he had this old barn for a studio, but Lee had to work upstairs in a small room to do her painting.
That's true, but that was her choice. I mean, she thought that Jackson was a great painter, a great artist, and she devoted herself to that proposition.
What Lee did, she decided that if he had some success, that he would have more confidence and he wouldn't get into these terrible depressions and drinking and so on. And I think it started out well when they moved here, and it really worked out very well for a while. She cultivated everyone who could be helpful to him in a worldly way and rather isolated him from his real friends. And I think that was a mistake.
As artificial as it is, I think this famous film is the most touching film ever of an artist working. It was a very unnatural, self-conscious, awkward process to make it. But every image of Pollock is full of tenderness. He agreed to paint on glass, so the camera could be literally within a picture developing. Pollock had been on the wagon for 2 years, but he was driven back to drink by the pressure of making this film. At the end of the last day of shooting, he knocked back tumblers of whiskey and started shoving the filmmaker, Hans Namath. "You're a phony," he shouted. "I'm not a phony, you're a phony." But the fact is that the film was a lie. In his drunken rage with Namath, Pollock was expressing a real anxiety. He really couldn't work anymore. He'd reached a point where his ideas were just dried up. By the mid-50s, Pollock had had exhibitions in New York and all over Europe. His art was argued about by the most powerful critics in America. He'd been on the cover of Life magazine. He was world famous. And yet, he didn't know where to go. He said he'd been in life, but all he knew about was death. He didn't know what was happening to him. He was disoriented. He was in despair. He told Lee to think of his irascibility, his violence, his drinking as a storm, that it would soon blow over. And then, on the night of the 11th of August, 1956, it did. Lee was in Europe. Pollock was in a car with Ruth Kligman, his lover, and Edith Metzger, Ruth's friend. It was an Oldsmobile he had just got in exchange for 2 small paintings. Pollock was driving and he was drunk. He was driving at 80 miles an hour. The car came to a curve in the road, a spot Pollock knew very well because it was only a few yards from his house, but he failed to slow down. Instead, the car sped into a group of oak trees. It ran up one of the trees and flipped over. Edith Metzger had been in the back, hanging onto the safety strap, calling out to Pollock to slow down, was rammed into the trunk of the car and crushed to death. Kligman and Pollock were each thrown from the car. Kligman suffered a fractured pelvis, but Pollock collided with a tree head first and was killed instantly.
He was too sensitive to criticism. That was bad. I think he was someone so he had no skin to protect him, you know. Everything would get at him. And I think that the success was both good and bad because he had gained confidence. But it was always exaggerated, you know, that he was the only painter and all that, which still was obviously insecure.
Why do I not care about all the Picasso myths so much, but want all the Pollock myths? There's so many things already in Picasso's art, so few in Jackson Pollock's. Just a misty space, a sublime nothingness. We want the sublime, but we want it to be attached to something. If it's Turner, we want a storm at sea. With Pollock, we want the car crash. We feel we're really getting something then. The last big story of Pollock's life, his descent into chaos and death. Welcome back to the Modern Art Tour. This is Planet Hot Dog, the continent of burger, the country of candy. What's this got to do with art? Or have we landed in the wrong place?
Coney Island, a complete art-free zone. There aren't any big ideas here, just fantastic, low pop mass dross. Who is responsible for collapsing this stuff into the world of high culture? One man.
Andy, do you feel that the public has insulted your art?
No.
Why not?
Well, I hadn't thought about it.
It doesn't bother you at all, then?
No.
Andy, do you think that pop art has sort of reached the point where it's becoming repetitious now?
Yes.
Do you think it should break away from being pop art?
No.
Are you just going to carry on?
Yes.
Here's Warhol with his icons of modern life. Modern celebrity, modern glamour, modern sexiness. When I first saw a Warhol, like everyone else probably, I couldn't see why it was art. It was a photo, surely. We hear about his great colour, and he is great at that, but what we first see are things, objects, soup cans, or Marilyn Monroe, or Jackie Kennedy. Jackie multiplied by 1,000,000. It's giddying. Liz Taylor, why is that art?
When Warhol was first becoming famous, he was asked what he thought about abstract expressionism. He just said, art is dead. Did he think he had killed art himself, or did it just die on its own? We certainly associate his name with a big question mark hanging over it. After Marilyn's in 1962, he painted a lot of Elvis Presley's in 1963. He painted double Elvises and single Elvises and triple Elvises. This one is 11 Elvises, all different and all the same. He painted the whole series very quickly. He painted 50 of them in an afternoon, but the studio was leaking and they were spoiled slightly, so he just painted them all again. All the things that in the abstract expressionist days were assumed to justify art's difficulty, its specialness, its sensitivity, its unrepeatability, its complexity and depth, he was happy to throw away. Being famous and being recognized, he thought, were better. It's one thing to have that thought, and the people he hung out with had thoughts like that all the time because they were stoned or drunk. But what Warhol was good at was showing what that thought might actually look like.
He had always been interested in glamour. From the time of seeing movies from Hollywood and the photoplay magazines, he always thought there was such a great glamour and magic about being a star. And I think he directed himself to find out what was glamour, you know, and how could I put it in a can and then just paint it around, actually paint glamour in a room or on a canvas.
Warhol famously came from the wrong side of the tracks, where there wasn't any glamour. This is Pittsburgh, where Warhol was born in 1928. He lived here with his mother and father, who came over from Czechoslovakia and who could hardly speak any English, and his two brothers, John and Paul. It was a simple, working-class life. Warhol was always ill as a child and read movie magazines in bed and ate chocolates.
I used to go out and buy him movie star magazines, you know, different theater magazines, which he got very fond of. He used to cut out the pictures. And then later on, he says, Paul, how can I get some of these movie stars' autograph, you know? And I says, well, I'll write to them, you know. So I wrote to a lot of movie stars, and a lot of them responded, especially like Shirley Temple. She sent them an 8x10 photograph to Andrew Warhol from Shirley Temple. You know, he prized that.
When I talk to Paul, I don't feel it's all that different to talking to anyone. He doesn't know who Warhol was any more than anyone else, because the artificial genius Warhol that everyone more or less knows is all he knows too.
I forget who I'm calling. magazine.
Warhol killed off his real self to make room for his art self. He made production line art because that was America, and he made himself into a parody genius because that was art. That was Picasso and Jackson Pollock, geniuses who expressed themselves. Warhol made a new self to fit the new world, expressing his new artificial self, his brainwashed American consumerist self. He was vividly expressing the world. He was the world in all its ordinariness and strangeness. He had to keep the new invented self going, though. He had his own manual, which he wrote himself, his famous book, Andy Warhol's Philosophy from A to B and Back Again. I enjoyed it as a student, and I expect I'll be coming round one of these aisles and reading extracts from it at any moment, if this ironic, easy-listening soundtrack is anything to go by. When you want to be like something, it means you really love it. When you want to be like a rock, you really love that rock. I love plastic idols. What makes a painting beautiful is the way the paint's put on, but I don't understand how women put on makeup. It gets on your lips and it's so heavy. Lipstick and makeup and powder and shadow creams and jewellery. It's all so heavy. I have a fantasy about money. I'm walking down the street and I hear somebody say, in a whisper, "There goes the richest person in the world."
Andy always said everything is on the surface, just look there and you'll see everything that's there. He didn't have an intention to be heavy materials-wise or to be deep image-wise. He liked being surface. He was audacious. And somehow he knew that what he was doing was right on point. It was always exactly what needed to be done at that exact time. And it was beyond being hip and cool even. It was genius.
Warhol is sometimes thought of as a light and breezy artist, sometimes as a rather dark one. I think of him as pretty dark, even at his lightest and breeziest. This installation, Silver Pillows from 1966, is Warhol's take on the ultra-seriousness of minimalist sculpture of the time, but also it's a complete negative, couldn't care less comment upon it. His pink and yellow cow wallpaper from the same exhibition, exhibited here exactly as it was then, in a room adjacent to his silver floaty pillows, is an up yours to contemporary abstract painting, with its abstruse theories of colour and flatness. Warhol's own paintings go from aggressive pastiche of the nice, his version of lovely impressionism is both gorgeous and sarcastic, to stark revelations of the horrible, his Death and Disaster series. Warhol took everything the mass media had to offer as if it was messages from the gods, and the gods always have a lot to say about death. Warhol himself was a regular churchgoer, so it's only right he should feel at home with religion's big subject, the end. With everything he does, there's the witty idea, often given to him by somebody else, as it was in the case of the Death and Disaster series, but also the cleverness and stylishness of the idea's execution, like picking the right title and the right scale for this painting called Foot and Tire, just big enough for the foot to be registered beneath the tire at a glance. And picking the right news photo car crash for this painting called 5 Deaths. The 5 teenage corpses are leaning on the grass, looking out, their eyes wide open as if they're feeling fine, but in fact they're crushed, mangled, and covered with blood. Ambulance disaster, the one vehicle you'd think you'd feel safe in, and white burning car. The repeated news photo image shows the burning car wreck and the driver grotesquely hanging from a telegraph pole, a casual passerby. Not just casually passing by and glancing at death, but not even bothering to glance, with the corresponding blank, empty nothingness of the last section of the series.
Can we do a cheese movie? All you have to do is say cheese, cheese. All right. No, the next one.
Here's Warhol filming Susan Sontag, frightening superbrain of the 60s, asking her if she wants to be in a movie about cheese.
Just what you're doing.
Warhol's paintings, Warhol's films, they're the same. They do the same thing. It was part of Warhol's genius to realize that could be so. Can film be art? We're still asking that question today. This is Andy Warhol's first film, Sleep, made in 1963, only a year after he first became famous as a painter. Just a man sleeping for 8 hours. Warhol used to go to underground films all the time with the poet John Giorno. He thought he could make one himself, so he bought a camera. What should he film, though?
Andy and I was sleeping together, and I was drunk, you know, like every once in a while I'd get up to take a piss, and there would be Andy, who was on speed, you know, would be looking at me, you know, and I would say, "What are you doing?" And he said, "Watching you." And then I'd go to sleep and wake up again, take another piss, and then he would, and so it was that night, for the lack of an idea what he was going to make a movie of, was he got the idea of making me sleeping.
Warhol shot hours of footage over different nights. Then he got into a tangle editing it. Finally, he just picked out the shots that brilliantly emphasized light and shade, so the film wouldn't seem too gay, to beat censorship laws. And he made it 8 hours long because that's how long sleep usually lasts, to conform to art's structural laws. In this film, there is the palpable sense of one of the elements of Warhol's genius, the way his art foregrounds sexuality, like Picasso's does, only of course not like it, because Warhol was gay and Picasso wasn't.
Great energy comes with sex, and drugs just magnified. And Andy understood all that. I mean, Andy was on speed himself, so he could see everything with enormous clarity. And then everyone else was on whatever drug of their choice was, and they all fucked. I mean, it was everyone was either straight or gay. It was a lot of sexuality, and Andy totally. I mean, that was the attraction for him to make movies. I mean, Andy didn't want to have sex. He wanted to watch. And as we know, he was a great voyeur.
Here's Blowjob, made in the same year as Sleep. Another film with a minimal structure. It's reality, but this is all you get. It's the same frame for half an hour, reality and abstraction coming together. Pardon my French, haha. It's a fine balance of elements, lost on some people who quite understandably are interested in the title, but a bit bored by the film.
I told Andy once in New York, I says, I'm going down to see one of your movies, you know, that's playing. And he says, look, they charge $3. He says, you give me the $3 and let me boot you in the rear end. He says, don't waste your time on it. So that was the answer that I got. But some of the family members were sort of critical about it. You know, my mother was very deeply into religion. She had faith in it, and she brought Andy up that way too, and brought all of us that way. I mean, on numerous occasions when we were up there, Andy's getting ready to leave, and he'd yell, Mother, I'm getting ready to leave. Come on in here and pray with me. And they knelt down in front of her altar and prayed, you know, for 5 or 10 minutes, and Andy would be on his way.
Warhol's pictures of death. How great they look, even though they're only silkscreen photos. How great he could make that technique be. Nobody knows what he really thought about death. Are these skulls pop death or death death? They were painted 10 years after he really did nearly die from an attempted assassination by Valerie Solanas, the author of the Scum Manifesto, the Society for Cutting Up Men. She came up to Warhol's famous factory studio and shot him one day in 1968. Warhol survived the shooting, but for the rest of his life he suffered constant pain from the wounds, which went on leaking horribly. But then in February 1987, he did die, tragically, from simple neglect, when his private nurse fell asleep following a routine gallbladder operation. His tubes just clogged up and he died. Here we are again in a graveyard, morbidly obsessing over modern art's dead dads. Warhol was a genius, but it was a new type of genius. He was a genius at expressing what it felt like not to be sure what you felt at all. He was a great psychologist. He observed what drives people and excites them. Not the people in his pictures and films, the icons, but the people who wanted to look at them, the public. He wrote books and made movies and produced records and painted paintings. A lot of it wasn't any good, but he looked at a wasteland and said, "This is modern art," and it was. Hey, it's young people's music. We're back in the now zone again. People of the 90s in Times Square, acting out a fashion myth, acting modern. Uh-oh, here's 70s man, head filled with the past, pondering the meaning of modernism. Is modern always modern? Does it run out? Is it something you get out the modern cupboard now and then and polish? Or is it always frighteningly alive? Warhol, Pollock, Picasso. They all stand for radical breaks with the past. Ugliness instead of beauty. America instead of Europe. Irony instead of anguish. I am what I am because of them. But now they're the past. Andy Warhol became part of culture in about 1962. A lot's happened since then. This is Millennium Modern Art. Damien Hirst spots in Lot 61, the latest media hangout in New York. I'm drunk now and jet-lagged from time travel, so I'm just talking rubbish. But if you ask me, what these spots say is that, like Andy Warhol's Silver Pillows, we are a form of art of almost unbelievable weightlessness, and yet we are quite good. How can that be? It's bright, decorative, eye-stimulating, exciting painting, doing all the things a painting should do. But it's all done mechanically with a compass, and with the colours not even being filled in by Hirst, but by an assistant. So something is missing. There's nothing to tell us what to feel. It expresses our culture's anxiety about the role of painting now. Does it have one? God, has it come to this? From Picasso's fabulous art of domestic life to all of modern art summed up in a restaurant. Art is dead, said Warhol. I am nature, said Pollock. I don't seek, I find, said Picasso. Vindaloo, says Hirst. Here we are, back where we started at my studio, a modern art greenhouse, where modern art minds are cultivated and nurtured. Here's an artist painting a psychedelic modern garden. This is modern art going on, but being different. Damien Hirst isn't the last chapter, he's just the leader of our present phase of modern art, where geniuses don't really exist, but creativity and inventiveness and not being straight and having your own system and not being polite all still do. And that's the answer to the thing we were wondering last time we were at my ambiently humming studio. We like modern art because we don't know what it is, and the reason it keeps changing is to make sure we never do.
This is Modern Art continues next week. Thursday, Ken Burns' superb series Jazz continues with the music taking new directions into the turbulent 60s. Join us for Jazz, 9:30 Thursday night. Stay with us now for the history of St. George's Chapel.